right, everybody, welcome. Just giving it a few seconds before I start launching into the meeting itself. Okay. All right, guys. Well, thanks everybody for being here. It's good to see you again. And let me just say, I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. Enjoyed the time off. Got to spend some nice, restful time with your family and friends. But it's good to be back with all of you guys today. And let me just say a few things about the upcoming dates and the remaining schedule. So, first of all, let me make sure that this is all out there. Have some of you guys noticed the announcement that I mailed out yesterday about the fourth homework assignment? Anybody can confirm? Just let me know. Yes. Okay, great. So, perfect. That's the detailed instructions. We're going to talk about it a little bit right now since we're all together in the live meeting. But anyway, that's your fourth and your last homework assignment. What we have left over now are just two things. You have that fourth homework and then the final exam. Notice that I edited the due date for the fourth homework just slightly, so it's going to be due Thursday, December the 9th, anytime before midnight on that date. So to be clear, you have all the way up till 11:59 p.m. on Thursday, December the 9th. So that's 9 days away from now. Yes, the final will be comprehensive, but we'll get to that final in due time. We have still got to give out the study guide for that, and we'll have 2 review sessions to get prepared. So there'll be a lot of good opportunity to cover all the material before we take the test. I'm just going to go over some of the info about the fourth homework while we're here in the same place. So basically, here's how it works. You're going to be asked to write a critical analysis of news media reporting. So I'm asking you to identify a television news broadcast and watch 30 minutes of the news show. And you're going to have to create 2 different pieces of documentation. One is just going to be kind of like, you could think of it as like a table of contents, which is going to list all the stories that occurred within the 30-minute viewing window. And in that part, you would just sort of give like a very brief, maybe like a 1-sentence synopsis of the content of the story. So it could be like, Biden implements vaccine mandate on small businesses, hurricane coming to New York, I don't know, verdict in the trial of Ahmaud Arbery, so like different stories that are reported on. You have to list all of them that were mentioned in the 30-minute window of time. And the other thing you have to do is use a stopwatch or some kind of time measurement device to keep exact time of each story. And so also you're going to have to say for me what the time signature of each story was, like how much time was given. So, it could be like weather report, 1 minute, 13 seconds. Lakers, LeBron James suspended, 48 seconds. So like you're going to be keeping time of the different stories, and that can come into play later in the second part of the assignment where you actually do your critical report, because sometimes it can be shown that more important stories are given less airtime often in news reporting. So if 5 minutes are given to celebrity sports, gossip, entertainment, but then just a little bit of time is given to like important questions of policy, diplomacy, international affairs, then that could be something that you might mention. Now, Gabriel, you asked, can it be multiple short episodes, and does it have to be mainstream cable media? Good questions, which I was going to address. So let me go over both of those points. The intention behind it is for it to be television news, yes. It doesn't have to be cable news. It could just be like your local, ABC news at 8 o'clock or at 11 p.m., just watching any of those kind of broadcasts too. But sure, you could use one of the cable news broadcasts like CNN, Fox, MSNBC, or whatever. Sometimes I think those cable news sources might be easier to critique because sometimes they have a little bit more political bias and partisanship, and so therefore it'd be easier for you to say where you think there are examples of fallacies, rhetoric, misleading editing tactics, or other attempts to shape the viewer's perspective on the issues reported on. So that's kind of your goal here. You're going to try and put on display many of the concepts that you've learned throughout the semester in your report. So the most successful submissions will find fault. We'll be able to identify areas where there was maybe fallacies, rhetoric, or other coarse concepts that you can somehow identify within the broadcast. So now, some people don't have TVs, I guess. Is that part of what you're thinking, Gabriel? It doesn't need to be cable. Even if you had just basic TV, you could use those shows as well. But sometimes, and I know this, sometimes in our modern day world, students don't even have any television or television service. If that is the case, and you have no way of watching a TV source, keep in mind that's the preference, though. Like, preference would be that you actually do find some kind of actual news broadcast to watch. But if you have no ability to do it at all, then you could, I guess, take an option to watch a re-uploaded version of a TV broadcast that's been placed onto like an internet YouTube channel. The best case scenario, though, would be if it's the official channel of the news broadcaster and that's simply uploaded from the original TV showing to the internet. And so it should still be for the same kind of like 30-minute block of time that an audience would have watched it on TV. So that's a possibility there. Multiple short episodes, I don't know about that. I think it should be one continuous news broadcast. But of course, there have to be a multitude of stories reported on within the broadcast, which brings me to another point. Do not use a news source that is only going to report on like one story. Sometimes there are news special features and stuff, so it'll be like 1 hour on the origins of COVID. But that's not the kind of story that I wanted you to do, because it's only one case. Part of my intention behind having you measure the amount of time given to the different stories is so that you can make comparative judgments about the value that the broadcaster assigns to the various news items. But if there's like only one or two stories, then it doesn't really show us that. So I would like it to be a traditional news broadcast, which has a variety of news topics that they talk about within the 30-minute viewing block of time. Now, sometimes there are shows that are longer than 30 minutes, which is okay, but you're only responsible for watching 30 minutes of it. So if I don't know, if you watch like Anderson Cooper 60-minute, news hour, then you would just watch 30 minutes of it. And when I say 30 minutes, I mean 30 minutes inclusive of whatever commercials or advertisements may be aired during the same broadcast. So like if it's a 30-minute show, but 21 minutes was them talking about the news, and then like 9 minutes was given to commercials or something, you're just responsible for the news content that's reported on. You also don't have to keep any kind of record of what commercials there were or how long those took. We're only talking about and thinking about the actual news broadcast itself. Okay. Hey there, Zoe. One thing you need to email me. Specifically you, Zoe. I see you here on the YouTube stream because there's a problem that you had with sending me your quiz. Okay, so I tried to email you about that, but I didn't get a response. Please follow up with me. Go in your emails and find my message, and we'll settle that issue. Okay. So thank you, Kyle, for saying your attendance. I'm going to ask everyone to report their attendance in a moment, but I'm just going to go over a few last details here about this fourth homework assignment. So what I'm telling you is you just have to watch a news show for 30 minutes. You have to keep an itemized list of all the stories that were reported on in that half hour, and also the amount of time designated to each. In that table of contents thing, you also should show the name of the news broadcast. So if it was like, I don't know, Tucker Carlson, Anderson Cooper, Rachel Maddow, you would give the name of the broadcast, then you would give the name of the station and the time and the date that it aired, right? So like, December the 1st, 7 p.m., MSNBC, Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, something like along those lines. And again, after you have the first part of the document, which just contains all that identifying information, then you have your 1 to 2 page typed report, which goes over areas where you found fault, criticisms, bias, manipulation, rhetoric, fallacies, and stuff like that. Okay, so it's 2 pages, or basically the written part, the written report where you actually go into the analysis. That would be 12-point font, double spaced, and that's about it. So that's your fourth homework assignment. I don't know if there's other questions about it that I could answer. If anybody has them, please let me know right now while we're all together, and I'll just take them as they come. But if it makes sense and it's clear, then we can just, I guess, move on to the topics for today's meeting. So are we all good on the fourth homework? It's due when? Next Thursday before midnight? It's on critical analysis of news media and a news broadcast. You watch 30 minutes of any news show that you want. Yeah, so good, Gabriel. I would be okay with the highly partisan and politicized cable news shows. In a way, I think that those would be even easier to find valid criticisms of because oftentimes they're full of fallacies and rhetoric, whether it's on the left or on the right. So yes, you may if you want to do that. Here's one other thing I should mention. I would like it to be current news. So I don't want you to going back into the archives and say I watched a re-uploaded version of a news broadcast from 2010 because news is only news when it's new. So I do want it to be something that's happening now, and therefore it would be great if these are news broadcasts happening like in the current time, and you're watching like the first airing of that broadcast. Okay. So I guess that's about it for the moment. If other questions pop up in your mind as you're uh, closer to its due date, then just let me know, email me, or contact me through office hours or during our meetings, and we can talk about those questions anytime. So then we've got that all clear. I'm grading the third homework and the third quiz. Those will be ready by the end of the week. So well before you submit your next and final homework, I'll get those done. I just have a few things that I have to take care of with other teaching duties and grading tasks, but they'll certainly be ready for you, and you can check your grade for that or for anything else by the end of the week. Okay. Now, aside from that, just about the calendar and the remaining dates that we have, here's how it all breaks down. So we have 3 lectures that are left. There's today, Thursday, and next Tuesday. And those 3 lectures are just going to all be on this last chapter that we're going to study, which is chapter 9 from the book. Chapter 9 is all about ethics, and so we're going to get started talking about ethics today. So it's today, Thursday, Tuesday, 3 meetings on chapter 9. Then there will be 2 review sessions where we'll get prepared as we can possibly get for the final. So that'll be next Thursday and then the following Tuesday. And then at Thursday of the 16th, that is the last day, and that's when you'll take your final exam. So all you have left now, aside from all the other earlier material, is the 4th homework and the final exam. I'll send out the study guide for the review sessions for the final before we get into those review sessions, and then we will have 2 full class periods to go over all the notes and topics one last time so that you'll be prepared for the final. Okay, so I guess that's that. Just wanted to make sure to make some clear announcements, and you'll have a record of this as I upload the YouTube video later too. Okay, cool. So let's resume our lectures. We just have one more chapter in the book to cover, and it's chapter 9. Let me take you on a little tour backwards in time through all the stuff that we've covered so far. So you asking me a question, Sky. Is it only one chapter we're going through right now, or is it all the chapter? No, it's just one chapter right now. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Sky. We will, wait, sorry, you're saying right now, right? Like today? Is that your question? Today we're talking about chapter 9. We don't do final review stuff until later because I have to give you the study guide. Just like we did with the midterm, right? The study guide's distributed to everybody, and we go over all the items on it one by one when we have a review session. But the review sessions don't happen until next Thursday, so I haven't given you the study guide yet. We're still in going through chapter by chapter mode. For the final, yes, it's from the whole semester. Yes, it's always cumulative. Yes, it's cumulative and it's from the whole semester. Okay, so hopefully that's clear enough. But thanks again for the question. I'm glad to be able to help you out with that. So now I'm going to go back over our material and just tell you how we got here, and then we're going to move on to chapter 9. So we started the semester talking about just basic concepts of logic and argument, like what even is an argument, what is deduction, induction, validity, soundness, and stuff like that. We also talked about some famous social psychology experiments, Milgram's and Bardo. We talked about what are qualities of a good critical thinker, barriers to critical thinking, benefits that come from doing it. So that was all like chapter 8 and 1 for the most part. Then we studied chapter 3, which was about language and communication, different functions of language, what language is, different types of definitions, qualities of a good definition, rhetorical devices. Then we moved on to chapter 4, which was all about knowledge and the limits of human knowledge. So like what is knowledge? What is justification, truth, belief? What are different forms of evidence? What are cognitive and perceptual errors that we can make when we try to form judgments? Okay, and that was chapter 4. Then chapter 5, as you know, was all about fallacies. So, like logically flawed arguments, what are the names of different fallacies? What kind of examples could be given of them? Um, we briefly then talked about the media and marketing, and how sometimes fallacious material can be presented in media, or how to critically engage with media and have digital literacy. And then, most recently, we all finished up chapter 12, which is about science. The history of science, the scientific method, assumptions of science. Let's see, um, qualities of a good scientific theory and stuff like that. Which brings us now full circle to the end, and we have one more chapter to cover. So it's chapter 9, and it's all about ethics. Okay, ethics. Now, I just want to kind of going to take it slow and go through this material in good detail. So the first thing I'd like to do is ask anybody if they have a sense in their own mind of what the word ethics refers to. I'm sure some of you have heard the word or used it yourself. Imagine that, you have a very curious and intelligent young sibling, like 12 years old, and they come to you and they say, "Hey, I heard a word today and I just don't know what it means. Ethics?" Now you're the adult, they're looking to you. What do you say to them? What is ethics about? Do you know, or can we say anything? The rights and wrongs and the differences between? That's very good, Kay. Yes. Ethics does have to do with the concept of morality and right and wrong. So, to put a fine point on it, here's how I would say it. Ethics. It is the study of morality and moral concepts. Study of morality and moral concepts. And that's good also, Gabriel. The problem that arises when two people's values conflict. Sure. We will talk about the difference between conflicting moral judgments. And Sky, you say, like a moral code that all humans should follow to better our community. Sure. So you're using the word moral, and this is all on topic. Yeah, ethics is about the moral, about the idea of values, about the idea of right and wrong, and subjects of that kind. So here's how I put it in our chat. Before I do that, though, let me just get this out of the way. If you want to verify your attendance, please leave a comment of whatever kind in the chat. I just use that to keep tabs, but no big deal. So whether you're in YouTube or Zoom, just leave any kind of comment to keep a record of your attendance. Are we good on that? Some of you might have already said something earlier prior to this in the meeting. If you did, that's fine. If you haven't yet, go ahead and leave it behind. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, sure, Gabriel, but it's not that simple. It's a lot of times students about your age, there's a very deflationary idea of ethics. Oh, I say it's good to kill. You say it's not. Who's right? Who's wrong? There's no answer. It's just made up. There's a lot more specificity and objectivity that many people have when it comes to the world of ethics. But we will get into it. We'll get into it step by step. So, and thank you guys for your attendance and your comments. So here we go. Ethics, the study of morality and moral concepts. Now, let's drill down into that even a little further. What are some moral concepts that you could say? Some of them we've already mentioned here in a couple of our passing remarks. But morality, moral concepts, they have to do with like distinctions, like what and what. Can you think of a pair of moral distinctions that are kind of like opposite of each other? It's a big hint for you. I think you should be able to tell me something on that. We could talk about morality in the sense of actions that are blank versus blank. What could be filling those blanks? Right and wrong. Okay, very good, Gabriel. Yes, right versus wrong. What's another possibility? Something else that's along the same lines, something like almost a synonym of right or wrong. We talk about right or wrong. We also sometimes refer to the difference between actions that are moral and, Gabriel, I would say immoral rather than amoral. The contrary of moral is immoral. So amoral means like it lacks any moral status, but immoral means it has a negative moral status. Okay, good. Moral, immoral, right versus wrong. What's some others? There's a couple more. Legal versus illegal. Okay, John, hold that thought, because we'll talk about the difference between law and morality in a moment. Although the two overlap a lot, they're not exactly the same thing, because basically there can be laws that are immoral And there can also be things that are illegal that are not immoral, at least reasonably speaking, and given certain examples that we can produce. It's possible to make moral criticisms of the law. So there's a little wiggle room between law and morality, but there's some relationship between them two. We'll talk about that. But I don't want to leave that as one of the concepts, only because it's a little bit of a gray area. Gabriel, you say good versus evil. That's fair. Yes, good and evil, right and wrong, moral and immoral. Um, or even if you wanted to use the less loaded term bad, good versus bad, morally bad, that's fair as well. Sometimes people talk about the difference between actions that are just versus unjust. So that's another given case. So also, because a lot of morality has to do with how we act or how we ought to act, we could also include a reference to the normative status of an action. So what one ought to or versus what one ought not to do. Okay, so the picture's coming a little bit more into focus now. With your guys' help, we've figured out that ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts. And within the realm of moral concepts, we have a set of terms and ideas like good and bad, right and wrong, moral and immoral, just versus unjust, how a person should act versus how they shouldn't act, morally speaking. Now, in ethics, we believe, and it's been discussed throughout the history of writings in ethics in the West, that there are three major categories of actions in ethics. So three main types of action in ethics. And let me go ahead and list them and we'll talk all about those. Okay, so there are the three major types of actions in ethics. First of all, we have actions that are morally impermissible. Okay, that's one. We also have a sort of the reverse of that, actions that are classified as morally permissible. Okay, and then we also have a category that goes even a little further and beyond the permissible acts, and that is what they call morally obligatory actions. Okay. Morally impermissible, permissible, and then obligatory. So we're going to go through these top to bottom, starting with the first. Just based on common sense and your intuitions, maybe you can judge what is a morally impermissible act or what the definition of morally impermissible is. Saying an act is morally impermissible is to say that it's what type of act? What do you think? What do those words suggest to you? Morally impermissible must mean that the act is what? If it's impermissible morally, in other words, it's not allowed, right? And so one way to say this is that it's something that's wrong, morally wrong, and because of that, it's not okay to do. Doesn't mean it's not possible to do. Of course, people unfortunately can physically do these things in many cases, but they're not morally acceptable. So that's right, correct. These are actions that are wrong, so morally impermissible. And to be, a little less formal about it, they're not okay to do. Actions that are wrong, they're not okay to do. So we're going to spend time on this before I move on to the next topic or the next category, morally permissible. So saying that an act is morally impermissible is saying of it that it is wrong and it's not okay to do. So I would say it's probably easy for us to identify some different clear examples of morally impermissible actions. So obviously there's a lot of things in the world that people can do that they in fact do sometimes do that are not right, that are wrong, that are not acceptable morally. So can anybody throw out like some clear, uncontroversial examples of actions that we would regard as morally impermissible, things that are wrong? So bad stuff. Killing, there you go, Alan, that's a clear case. So, murder, killing of the innocent without cause, not an act of self-defense or judicial punishment. That's clearly morally impermissible. The person's right is not yours to dispose of, and they have a right to their own life. So I would say that's high on the scale of morally impermissible actions. That's a good, clear example. But not every impermissible act is killing. What's some others that are either more or less grave than that? Good example to start, killing. But let's open up the discussion for others. You say, Gabriel, some would argue that drugs are morally impermissible. But remember what I just said, Gabriel? Did I not say to give an uncontroversial example, an example that all of us can agree with? Since the use of drugs is something that some people will say we have a moral right to do, but others will say that, I don't know, it's harmful to the individual. So, in the interest of protecting society, the government establishes rules that you can't do it. That's something that can and is, in fact, debated. There are live policy debates going on right now about whether we should federally legalize marijuana for recreational use. And legislators are actively debating this in the halls of Congress and in other places in our country. So I was hoping for something that would be not in a gray area. But I take your point. It is something that some people argue is morally impermissible. I see Alan and Madeline and Alan have both referred to stealing. And generally, with some exceptions, this is clearly a case of something morally impermissible because we have property rights, we think, meaning that you're entitled to retain possession of your own things. And therefore, if someone steals them, that's not a valid transfer of ownership authorized by the current owner. So that's a good example. Of course, we can imagine possibly some complicated scenarios in which stealing could be justified morally. I'm not sure if I would say so, but I can imagine a person making an argument. Did somebody steal to feed their starving child? Did somebody, does somebody believe Robin Hood is like a moral example to follow, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor? Well, anyway, I don't want to make it too complex, but for the most part, yes, stealing is regarded in general as a bad thing. Kidnapping, okay, yes, holding someone falsely, imprisoning them without due process of law, that's a violation of their rights, and that would certainly be a clear case. Stripping a human of their identity, you say, Sky? Like, it's a bit of a abstract way of putting it. How would one do that? Like, I don't know, locking them in a basement and I don't know, like Jeffrey Dahmer, like drilling a hole in their brain or something. I don't know. Like, yeah, it's hard to fill in the blanks for your example, but I could agree. Yeah. Kay, you say lying in court. Well, lying in court is perjury and it's illegal, but it's not impossible for somebody to imagine that they're lying in court only to prevent the prosecution of somebody that didn't do something wrong. So I can imagine some people try to justify morally their act of perjury, even though it's a violation of the letter of the law. And that's a reminder to us, which we will come back to in a moment, that law and morality are not always the same thing. So you guys have given some fair examples. Let me throw a few more out there that I would hope we can all agree on. Rape, genocide, torture. It's, all these kind of things can be considered morally impermissible, and I find it hard for a person to imagine justified scenarios of doing those things. So there's a wide spectrum, all the way down from little lies all the way up to genocide of a whole race of people. And these are all bad things that are wrong and not okay to do. So let's go ahead then and go to the next. We've got morally permissible actions. And based on what we've already said about impermissible, this maybe will be easy enough for you to point out. What do you think it means then to say that it is permissible, morally permissible, not impermissible, but rather permissible? What does this mean? If the impermissible actions are wrong and they're not okay, then by contrast, the permissible actions would be what? Yes, they would be allowed and they would be okay to do. So these would be actions that are not wrong. And again, they're simply okay to do. Now, sometimes when I ask people, what do you think is a morally permissible action? They will say, oh, well, because impermissible are things that are wrong, then these are things that are right or good. And I know why people would say that, because like right or good is kind of the natural contrary of the word wrong. But I prefer to put it more minimally as not wrong rather than a more forcefully expressed, is good. And the reason for that is this. When people say an action is good or right, they sometimes mean that like it involves some kind of noble sacrifice to really benefit others or whatever. So if you go and you give out meals on Thanksgiving at the homeless shelter, people might say that was good and that was right. And it is. And it is morally permissible, but it's not limited to those acts that create a big benefit for other people. It's also including all those little things that don't necessarily change things much for the better, but they're also not wrong and they don't harm anybody. So, like, if I'm chewing gum, that's morally permissible too, just as much as helping an old lady across the street is morally permissible. But chewing gum doesn't really benefit anybody or help anybody per se. It's just that it's not wrong. It's not anything that anybody can condemn as an impermissible act. That's a violation of moral rules. So now that I've given you that description, can anybody throw out some examples of actions that are morally permissible? And while you're thinking of it, I'll just say this. I've gotten the vibe that this is a good class with a lot of good moral people in it. So I would hope that this isn't so easy for you because, right, almost all of your behavior fits in this category because usually you don't do things that are wrong, I would hope. So pick and choose some examples of random things. There's so many random things you could choose that are morally permissible. Okay, Gabriel, chewing gum, fair enough. But how about your own example, something a little bit more original? That's good, though. That's true. But I did just say it. What's something else? Anything on that spectrum of morally permissible acts? What do you think? Chewing gum, really? That's all we've got? Walking, okay, sure. Attending this class, yes. Just kidding. Shame on you. No, never mind. You're not doing anything wrong by being in this class. Picking up trash, sure. And that's maybe a little bit more beneficial. Sleeping, yes. I've noticed that you guys are leaning heavily on the ones that don't really benefit others, which is fair. But it also does include, like, I don't know, helping somebody prepare for their exam, giving someone a compliment, whatever, giving blood to donation services, donating to charity, sure, all that's good. Taking a hike, buying a house, eating food, good. That's good. Sitting down, yeah, sure. Eating food, as long as I guess it's not a human person or something, yes, that's fair, Sky. So yeah, you guys seem to be clear on this point. Morally permissible actions, they're just things that are okay to do and they're not wrong, whether they're of huge significance or value to others or whether they just are within your rights and they don't violate other people's rights. Okay, and that's also good. Yes, giving aid, counsel, advice to your friend. That's a good thing. That's not wrong. Okay, so we got one more though, which is morally obligatory. So then what do you think morally obligatory means? Let me say a few things while you're thinking there. So just looking at the word itself, to say it's obligatory is going over and beyond just being permitted. To say something's morally obligatory, what do you think that means by general definition? Yeah, that you must do it, that it would actually be wrong to not do so. So morally obligatory acts are like morally mandatory instead of like morally optional. They're moral requirements on us. No, not they don't cause harm to others, Sky, or at least that would not be the general case. Morally obligatory actions are good and they're morally required. So morally obligatory acts that you must do and it's wrong not to do. So notice that like with morally permissible, there's a lot of those things that you may do, but you're not obligated to. But now with obligatory, it's a different description. It's something that you would have to do and it'd be wrong not to. So maybe it'll take a moment for us to come up with good examples, but see if you can. What do you think could be something that's morally obligatory? Okay, good, Gabriel, not killing people, not stealing. I noticed that you've figured out one thing logically, which is good. The morally impermissible acts are wrong to do, okay? So it is true that you have an obligation to not perform any of them. So since we know that it's wrong to, say, commit rape or kill or whatever, steal, then you have a moral obligation to not do those things, okay? So since it's impermissible to kill, you're obligated not to do that. But you can also have moral obligations to positively perform certain acts, Gabriel, and others. So the non-performance of what's impermissible, yes, that's an obligation. Likewise, not doing what you're obligated to do is impermissible. What could be a affirmative moral obligation? A negative one is don't do something. So what could be an affirmative one, which is to do something? So far, though, that's good. It's correct to give those examples about not killing, stealing, and so on. But what do you think could be an affirmative moral obligation? Sky, if you see someone drop their wallet, you're obligated to notify them before they walk away. Sure. I mean, I would say so probably. I only want to complicate things for you just a little bit because some people might argue that I'm under no obligation to act in the interest of other people, I'm merely obligated not to do harm to them. So some people have that more limited conception of morality, that you have a duty to do no harm, but you don't have a duty to benefit. Nonetheless, I would argue that this is a fairly stated moral obligation, and I've been the beneficiary of that actually myself. Thinking back, one time I dropped my wallet walking around a parking lot of an Aldi grocery store, and I was so scared that I was going to lose it. This is also during the early days of the pandemic, and so I was like, man, I'm going to have to go to DMV now, and I don't even know how that's going to go. But a nice lady saw me walking around looking all over, and she said, "Is this your wallet?" That was nice. That was like last summer. But anyway, anecdote aside, stealing wallet of a rich person if you use it to feed your kid. I see you really like the morally complex examples. There's room for argument about that. Sure, Gabriel. Some people that hold some kind of moral theories might argue yes, but there is different moral theories that we're going to actually study as we get through this chapter. And so you're going to see that there's no general, universally agreed to answer. It depends on the moral theory that one appropriates. In utilitarianism, perhaps yes. In Kantianism, no. But we have to learn those topics to give the reasoning behind it. Keeping a promise. Now, that's very good, Kay. Promising does generate a moral obligation. So if you don't want to have to be obligated to do something, then you should not promise to do it, because by promising, you affirm that you commit yourself to the act. And so you generate an expectation on others that you'll follow through. Let's talk about one perhaps conspicuous type of promise, the vows that people exchange when they become married. So you're standing up there, in front of the whole congregation of people at the wedding, and maybe God, if you believe in that, and the state, somebody empowered by the state to pronounce you guys man and wife, or husband and husband, whatever the case is. And, the vows are given. So do you vow to love, honor, and obey this person till death do you part? And you say, I do. You've at that time made a promise, and say that you violate the promise later by cheating or going outside the relationship. That's a moral, that's a violation of a moral obligation that you generated through the act of promising. Signing a contract could be a legal obligation, and I would say it doubles as a moral obligation because it's the same thing as vowing to do it or to follow through on the terms of the contract. And then, Gabriel, you gave the case of helping injured people if you have the training to do so. Yes, many would say that if it's an easy rescue, which doesn't pose any harm or risk to you, then you're morally obligated to do it. Like if you saw a drowning child and all you have to do is pull them up out of a body of water and poses no risks to you, then you're morally obligated there. Some people might say, though, that if it's going to put risks or threats to you, then you're at liberty to decline to assist. Okay, so with moral obligations, maybe a few others that are often mentioned, like say you have a child and you've taken custody of the child, like you haven't given them all to adoption agencies or the like, or like you're not a surrogate mother who is just allowing the fetus to gestate so that it can be given to the real guardian. So suppose you've had a child in a normal way and you've taken custody of the child. Don't you feel it's a moral obligation to care for and provide for this child throughout their childhood? It's not an option. It's something that we say is a moral obligation because it's your actions that have led to their existence and everything else and their dependency on you. So I don't know, how about this? Paying the tab when you have eaten the food at the end of the meal at the restaurant. There's an implied agreement that the receipt of the money is exchanged for the giving of the food. So, in a way, I guess that would be like an act of theft, but you can spin it as a positive obligation to pay. Okay. Now, notice that not all the things that are morally permissible are obligatory. We say chewing gum is morally permissible, but are you obligated to chew gum? No. So everything that you're morally obligated to do, by extension, is permissible because you can't be obligated morally, at least, to do something wrong. But not everything that's permissible is obligatory. And that now, I hope, is clear. So one more thing to say before we move on to the next batch of topics here is there's a difference between law and morality. So we cannot confuse or simply oversimplify the idea of morality. Sorry, to get a sip of water. We cannot oversimplify the idea of morality down into just what's legal and illegal. Like, it's not like moral and immoral means legal versus illegal. The two concepts overlap a lot, and we hope they don't deviate too much from each other. But the reason they're not the same exact thing is because it's possible for people to make moral criticisms of law. It's possible to say that a law itself is bad. as people do when they engage in civil disobedience and protest against an existing law. Or sometimes there could be things that are illegal, but people don't think that they're wrong. So if we didn't think there was any difference between law and morality, then there would never be any valid basis to critique the law. It would be as though those critics were themselves doing something immoral because they're standing against the law, which represents morality. So to make this even clearer, let me ask anybody here, can you think of any kind of practice or institution that was at least at some time legal, but it was always wrong? At least common sense tells you even when this was legal, it wasn't okay, it was wrong. Can you think of something legal but wrong? Okay, good. You refer to segregation, Gabriel. That's good. Even slavery could be mentioned, perhaps even more grave moral wrong than segregation because it treats people as property instead of just keeping them separated. Both are bad. But yeah, so was slavery ever legal? Yes, it was. But even when it was legal, moral common sense tells you that it was not a good or just institution to have. Um, if it if law and morality coincided, then it would be like saying that the people like Harriet Tubman who tried to free escaped slaves were doing something immoral because they were breaking the law. That would be like saying that people who gave safe harbor to Jewish citizens during Nazi Germany's reign were doing something more wrong because under the laws they had, you were supposed to report those people in their legal system. So laws are made not by gods, but by men, and therefore there's always room for moral criticism of an established law even today. And Gabriel, I guess coming back to your earlier example, some people will say that drug use, although it's federally criminalized, certain kinds of drugs, it's not itself immoral. Some people are libertarians that say I should be free to take risks with my own health and the substances I put in my body. It's no one else's business. Don't tread on me, etc. Get the government out of my private life. But some people would say that although those laws exist, they're not good laws. I'm not saying I agree with that, but since the point was made earlier, that's another fair example. Some people are opposed to legal access to abortion. There's a whole pro-life movement that finds fault with the Roe versus Wade decision, but that decision did establish a constitutional right to abortion in all 50 states. It has stood for about 50 years. But of course, there's some people that say, despite that, it's been a moral atrocity to have this legal practice exist for that time period. So anyway, guys, when you think about morality, as you're studying it academically or just thinking about it on your own, you have to think about yourself as not just subject to law, but as though you are the legislator, him or herself, who institutes and makes decisions about law, right? Because say if you're the legislator in Congress and the bill comes to your desk, what will you vote, yes or no, on federal legalization of recreational marijuana? You can't just say, well, I'm going to vote how the law tells me to vote, because now you're the law maker. And therefore, you have to make an original determination about whether it would be good in some sense or bad for this law to be placed into the books of society. So you should think about questions of law and morality as though you're the jurist who is going to weigh whether this is in fact a good or bad law, instead of just the subject who says, well, I'm duty bound to follow the law that comes down from above. Okay, so just understand that when we think about morality, we're thinking about something that's actually prior to law, because we evaluate the quality of a law based on our moral principles. It is not as though legal principles force us to judge moral questions. It's the other way around. Okay, so with that all in place, we can continue from there. The next little term from the book that I guess we should learn or know is what's moral reasoning. So moral reasoning is when you make a decision about what's right or wrong, or about what you should or shouldn't do. Okay. Reasoning. So, as human beings, we're capable of engaging in moral reflection, and that's something unique to humans. It's only human beings that can say, "Well, somebody did something, but it's wrong," or a human can say, "I did something, but I regret doing it because I know that it was wrong." Animals, lower animals, and stuff, they just act on their immediate instincts and impulses towards survival. But they can never say, for example, "Here's something I would like to do, and even though I perceive it to be in my self-interest, I will withhold on it because I recognize that it's a violation of moral principles." So we are capable of engaging in moral judgment, and we do all the time. Sometimes you observe acts or policies in society, and you make moral criticisms or you praise them. You say, that was a good thing or a bad thing. You may look at a verdict of a trial and say, I agree and I think it was right and justice was done. Or you may say, no, this was a miscarriage of justice and it was wrong. Just to mention one possible example. Sometimes you are the subject of other people's moral judgment, right? Sometimes people will look upon your actions and say, credit to you and you get praise because you did the right thing. Or sometimes people will criticize and condemn your behavior, saying of you, you've done something wrong and you should feel some guilt for that. So moral reasoning is what happens when we engage in those judgments, when we try to weigh what's the right or wrong action or policy, or in more personal terms, what you should specifically do or not do in a given situation, morally speaking, right? Now, one thing here, sorry. So it's when you make a decision about what you ought or ought not to do, or about what position is right or just. The next thing to talk about are different types of values. So in ethics, we talk about the difference between moral values and non-moral values. So here we go. First of all, moral values. So these are values that we hold, which are beneficial to ourselves, but also other people. And the thing is, they're considered good for their own sake. So let me write that and then we'll discuss. Values that are beneficial to, that benefit ourselves and others. And are considered good for their own sake. All right. And let me give examples here, as the book does, about what some of these types of values are. Examples given could be things like forgiveness, justice, compassion, altruism. Okay, so now to discuss this material. So values are things that we care about that motivate our behavior in certain ways. And the values that you hold can be either moral or non-moral. So the moral values are values that benefit yourself, but also other people. And the thing is, they're considered good for their own sake, meaning that even if they don't necessarily result in anything productive or beneficial, perhaps, we still think they're good regardless, just because it's good in and of itself to possess these values and to display them in your behavior. So like, I'll go over the case of forgiveness. Suppose that you hold forgiveness as an important value. So if you're a forgiving type of person and you value forgiveness, then that's going to be a benefit to other people to whom you are willing to show forgiveness, right? So that allows them to return to the circle of friendly relations with you, and to get back into your good graces and to be allowed some kind of ability to recover from whatever, I guess, harmful behavior that they that required the act of forgiveness in the first place. So of course, to be forgiven is a benefit to the one that's forgiven, as opposed to being shut out forever, cut off, and utterly canceled from the person's life. On the other hand, though, the forgiving person, the one who does the forgiving, is also benefiting, because the alternative is to hold on to those feelings of resentment and harbor them and have that hostility and resentment that you carry with you through life, which is sort of psychologically tense and discomforting. So there's actually a benefit to you from being a forgiving sort of person, because you can lighten your psychological burden and load of carrying around with you the ongoing resentments against the target of forgiveness. So forgiveness, when it's shown, is a benefit to all sides, to the one who is forgiven and to the one who does it. But, okay, let's go into the third point. Can it ever happen? We will get into that, Gabriel, but it's a sort of a different context, legally as opposed to interpersonally. But I don't totally disagree with you that it can sometimes be that a person is too forgiving in cases where they probably should have held a grudge. But I digress. I wanted to add one more point, but we'll come back to your question. So here's a question, everybody. Has it ever happened where you've been forgiving, or maybe not you, but just in general, has a person ever forgiven somebody and nonetheless they still got betrayed again by the same person who they forgave? So they forgave them for something, whatever it was, and the person kind of took advantage of it and double-crossed them again or mistreated them yet again despite the forgiveness. Can that happen? Can someone who is forgiven still do you wrong? Sure, it can happen, yes. And from the all caps, I guess I get the sense that some of you have maybe even experienced this, or you have a very vivid sense that it's yes. And yes, that can certainly happen. But even when it happens, and maybe it's the exception rather than the rule, but when it happens, as it may, we still don't think of the person who has forgiveness in their heart as a bad person or that it was somehow wrong for them to be forgiving. We just say it's good for its own sake, in and of itself, to be the type of person who's willing to forgive, even if sometimes, as it may happen, it doesn't reach the intended outcome. So that's what it means when it says considered good for its own sake. For the most part, it's going to be a benefit to all. But even if it didn't reach any kind of productive results, we still consider it good because we don't think it's only good to be forgiving when you win or when you get something beneficial at the end. Um, yes, and there's John. It's a good example. Kids will sometimes use this against their parents, but it happens all the way throughout adult life too. Let's go over some other cases. Justice. So you value justice, right? That means that you want to treat people fairly and not have bias, give people what they deserve and not what they don't. So if you treat people fairly and justly, they're going to be well served by you because they're not going to be the targets of discrimination, bias, or whatever else. But also, you, of course, benefit from being a just person who has that kind of example to provide because you know that you have the clear conscience that comes from doing the right thing for the right reasons. So justice, when it's displayed to others, is a benefit to those who are shown justice, but it's also a benefit to those who exhibit it. Sometimes, though, you treat people fairly and they will still betray you and be unfair back. So they don't reciprocate the just treatment, the fair treatment. But even if so, we still think it's better rather than worse for you to be the kind of person who's disposed to act that way. So that's the general picture here of these moral values. They're good for you, but also others. So they're not merely self-centered or selfish. And even when they don't benefit anybody, as may sometimes happen, they're still thought to be good. Now, let's compare this to the non-moral values on the other side. Okay, so non-moral values are other values. These are goal-oriented values. So they're a little more self-interested. They're goal-oriented values that are desired as a means to an end. So Gabriel's question here, what defines moral values is whether they're socially positive. The point is that they're not done for the sake of obtaining some benefit necessarily. They generally do benefit, but even when they do not, they're considered good in their own right, just internally, because they have intrinsic value, right? So it's like intrinsically valuable to be forgiving, even if it doesn't produce any positive results. The socially and individually positive side effects of behaving this way are expected in the most mainstream of cases, but that's not a requirement for these things to hold value. So it's a bit of a subtle answer I'm giving you here. It's not necessarily that they're socially positive, although that's bound up with the reason that we think they're good. They're considered good for their own sake, even if no positive outcomes result. But by the way, the positive outcomes generally do result. As you guys know, as I'm hoping you would know or agree, Gabriel, when you're nice to people, it's usually rewarded. Of course, there are sometimes scoundrels out there who are just waiting for the opportunity to take advantage of or to manipulate someone's kindness to their own benefit. But we don't think that it's only good for you to be kind in cases where it's going to work out to your advantage. We think it's good regardless, just because it's good in and of itself, with no need to mention the outcomes in the end, to have that disposition. So it's based on like a very core intuition that these things are good in and of themselves. That's what defines them as being moral values. The goodness that they have in and of themselves, regardless of whether they achieve any desirable results. But it's also mentioned, and it's fair to say, that they generally, with some exceptions, do produce the positive results. If they didn't, by the way, why would anybody think, that you had any expectation of good outcomes from behaving in these ways? I hope we're not so cynical and jaded that we think that you just stand to lose every time you try and be moral. That's certainly not true. Okay, so non-moral values. These are goal-oriented values that are desired as a means to an end. Well, there's a difference, Gabriel, between value and benefit. There's a difference between utility and moral value. That's your answer. But I have to give examples of these non-moral values now. So non-moral values include things like this. um, Fame, wealth, prestige, popularity, etc. So those would be examples of non-moral values. Now, suppose that you really value wealth, and so when you make a decision, you make a decision with a view towards how it could promote or enhance your wealth. That's a goal-oriented value. It's not desired for the sake of necessarily benefiting anybody else, but it's to your own self-interest that you have these goals of attaining wealth. But why do you really want the wealth? It's not for its own sake. You want the wealth as a means to the end of being happy and pleased, because you think that by having the wealth, of course, you'll have the ability to have increased purchasing power, financial security, and you believe that will make you happy. So the reason you want these non-moral values is because you think of them as a sort of instrument to get you towards the real outcome that you want, which is pleasure or happiness. That's why they're also sometimes called instrumental values, because we only care about them not for their own sake, but as a tool or a stepping stone to get to the happiness that we want on the other end. And that's the same with these other things. Why does a person want popularity? Because they think that it will make them happy. They don't want it to benefit other people per se, but to make their own happiness and pleasure increase. Same with fame, same with prestige. The thing is, though, if these things did not lead to the desired goal, then a person wouldn't value them for their own sake. Like, so suppose that a person became wealthy, famous, popular, but then they were still depressed and they ended up committing suicide, as you sometimes see with, like, I don't know, at least some examples of like famous celebrities that have done that. You might say that in that case, although they had these non-moral values going, they didn't achieve the typical goal that they are designed to lead us to. So non-moral values are important. It's not that we're saying they're bad or something, and the moral values are the only ones that are good. Both matter. Both are important to a well-balanced life. But the textbook mentions, and I think it's fair to say, that you have to have at least a good, healthy dose of those moral values in your value system as well. Because if you have an entirely self-focused, means to an end type of approach to life, there are even cognitive and psychological studies which show that that does not control ultimate contentment and satisfaction at the deepest level. There's something about having a genuine human connection to other people that requires some capacity to care for the other and not just yourself. So that kind of deeper and more abiding sense of moral satisfaction and happiness in life can come from some of these moral values. A life spent purely in the pursuit or appreciation of non-moral values can seem hollow, trivial, and in some cases, not the most deeply satisfying. So, ironically, there's even some type of self-interested motives behind having these moral values. There's a couple of layers of complexity here. Wanting to be, in some sense, morally conscious for the reasons that we've given, but also a side effect of it is that you will be happier for the most part being that way. Okay, so consider which values motivate your choices and beliefs in life and decisions. Non-moral values such as wealth can contribute to happiness, but they're not the whole picture about what makes a person happy in human life overall. There's also some evidence to show that people who are better critical thinkers are a little bit better at moral reasoning too. So when you have moral reasoning, you have to judge whether something's right or wrong or what you should or shouldn't do. Being the kind of person who can weigh complex arguments and evidence can also assist in that kind of judgment. So there's some kind of link between the ability to make fair and reasonable judgments about matters of truth and falsehood, and on the other hand, to make determinations about what's right and wrong morally. Okay. So the next thing to speak on is the concept of the conscience. What is the conscience and how does that play into the moral landscape? So let's get into that. Okay, conscience. Not to be confused with the word consciousness. I've noticed that a lot of people mix these up, but they're not the same thing. Consciousness is just like literally having a mind that can perceive anything. So, the fact that you can hear my voice right now, for example, and you have like a auditory system and a visual system, and you can just perceive your environment with your five senses, that means you have consciousness. But the conscience is different. Conscience is a moral concept, and it has to do with some kind of internal source of knowledge about what's right and wrong. So that's what it is, conscience. An innate source of knowledge about what is right and wrong. Okay. Conscience. So the conscience is that like little voice within you that will try to instruct you in the proper moral behavior, and that sometimes will also burden you with feelings of guilt if you've done something that you think is not consistent with your own moral principles. That's when we sometimes refer to the so-called guilty conscience, or on the other hand, someone has a clear conscience because they know they've done the right thing. The word innate means that it's something that is somewhat naturally engendered within us. We're sort of born with a conscience, but even though it's innate, as with other innate aptitudes that like the ability to acquire language, um, it may be either nurtured and supported by our environment and our upbringing, or it may not. And so, without the proper stimulation and input, the conscience can be allowed to wither and to become not fully developed. In the same way, I can give an analogy to the ability to learn language. So humans, we're unique in the case that we can learn language, but other animals can't. But you won't learn the language, even if you're a healthy cognitive subject, human being, if you're not provided with the right kind of exposure to it in your early years. So there have been a few interesting cases where children were born and abandoned and somehow survived in the wild, like under the care of wild animals, which, can you believe it? But this really happened. And in one case of this, they found this feral child, as they call them, um, and she was like 5, 6, 7 years old, but she could never learn how to speak, even though she had no cognitive disabilities, because through that entire initial time period, she's living in the wild, not encountering human language, and therefore the right kind of setup for the development of full language capacity never established. So in the same sense, without having the proper kind of moral education or early childhood experiences or communal or environmental inputs, you may have your conscience allowed to wither and become weak or not fully developed. But in general, it's innate with some exceptions. Um, Now, the conscience has an emotional element that motivates us to act a certain way. And so effective moral reasoning requires that we listen to that conscience. I know sometimes people don't like the uncomfortable feelings of having a guilty conscience, but the opposite extreme is even worse. A person who feels nothing, no matter what they do, and could do the worst things possible, but couldn't care less or feel anything about it, that's a psychopath, that's a sociopath. And nobody should aspire to fit the model or description of that kind of person. So even though it may sometimes make you sad or whatever to reflect on, your own conduct if you didn't think it was appropriate or right, it's better to be like that kind of person who can be in touch with your moral side of life than a person who has no sense of right or wrong and doesn't even care. Doesn't that mean the conscience is just a product of your environment or culture? Well, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, because as I've tried to say here, the wild kids still have the ability to learn language. It's innate within the human being, unless they have like a serious cognitive disorder or disability, mental disability. Um, but it wasn't properly attuned, it wasn't properly cultivated. So, I mean, like, a little plant has the capacity to become like a big tree, but if it's deprived of sunlight, then it will become anemic and it won't fulfill the potential that it does, after all, have. So, in the same sense, right, the conscience is something that's somehow ingrained, but it does require the proper environmental support. So, there's like a nature that's founded on a natural uh, feature of the human cognitive equipment, but there's a nurturing aspect to it, as many can distinguish the nature and nurture divide. You say it's learned, not inherent to one's nature, but Gabriel, we keep going over the same kind of problem here. Both are true, but it's more inherent to say that it's born into you and it needs the proper activation. Don't you understand, or don't you agree that language is something that is, at least at the level of ability to learn it, innate in a human being? A baby that's born today doesn't speak language. It's just saying goo goo gaga and all the rest. But it has the ability to learn that language in the ordinary course of events. just because it has that ability to learn it and it's only going to be activated by being in a linguistic environment does not mean that language just somehow has no kind of natural endowment in the human mind. It just means that there needs to be the proper environmental support for it. So I don't know that it's best to describe this as an either or. The way I'm construing it is that it's fundamentally inherent to the human ability, but it still needs to be properly developed with the right stimulated inputs. So let's move to the next. Our conscience sometimes speaks to us by revealing to us what we call moral sentiments, or at least that's what our book calls them. So let's refer to that briefly. So moral sentiments are emotions which alert us to moral situations and cause us to want to do what's right in those situations. Okay. Emotions that alert us to moral situations cause us to want to do what's right. And the book lists for us a couple of these different moral sentiments, I should say. So one of them is compassion, and that is the ability to imagine and care about the feelings of others. So okay, so compassion is one of our moral sentiments, and it ties us to other people. Sometimes people say, I feel for you, or I feel your pain. I understand what you're going through. I relate. When we have those types of sentiments, we're feeling the sentiment of compassion. And if other people are going through a hard time, a struggle, or whatever, and if you have compassion for them, then not only can you understand what they're going through, but you also kind of, you care about it. And those are two separate things. It's one thing to be able to understand that someone's suffering, but it's another thing to care about it and to want to counteract it. Um, so it's kind of like empathy. Some people call compassion a close cousin of empathy. It's like empathy in action, because oftentimes when you're compassionate, you're going to want to actually do something to act on the basis of these feelings that you can identify with and that you care about. So that's another, I think, clear example. Um, Now, here's another one the book includes, which I think they awkwardly title, but I'll just use their term, helper's high. Helper's high is when you are helpful to other people, but then you feel good about yourself as a result of that. So you help others and feel good about yourself as a result. Okay, so um, human beings are supremely social creatures. There's a lot of animals that are, but only human beings can work cooperatively, not just in one lifetime, but across generations, spanning generational divides to establish systems that allow us to all live and thrive together, whether those are technological systems, communication, transportation, um, language itself, literature, and all the rest. So we work together as human beings to develop all these systems. We're not just isolated little atoms hunting and gathering and caring just for our own immediate circumstances. If that was so, then all the trappings of modern life that we have all around us never would have come to be. So human beings are social, and that means that we have to work together cooperatively to achieve things that we couldn't do by ourselves alone. So there's almost kind of like an evolutionarily based reward mechanism for being socially helpful to other people. And if you've ever been this way, you would know that it's like that warm, fuzzy feeling that comes from just feeling a positive sense of self regard, that you're helpful to other people, that you're showing altruism, care, etc. to others. Um, so there's, I guess, like a little bit of a positive mechanism that induces us to engage in helpful behavior. Um, Next up, we can talk about um, so moral outrage versus resentment, two more of these so-called moral sentiments. So what's moral outrage? Moral outrage is simply when you perceive something that you take to be unjust and then you become upset because of that. Okay, so it's not all just uh, positive and happy things going on in the world. Of course, sometimes any number of us can observe, witness, or even be party to actions that we think are just completely wrong or fundamentally unjust. And when you see something that you think is unjust happening, whether it's in open society or in a more personal context, it can induce this moral sentiment of outrage, moral outrage. Um, Now, I want to quickly make a distinction between this moral outrage concept and another one that the book mentions, which is slightly different, which is resentment. Resentment is a more personal version of moral outrage, where you are the direct victim of the unjust behavior, whatever it is, and so you become upset, but it's because you are the one who's been mistreated. So when you are the victim um, of an injustice and become upset. So, like, here's an example to distinguish between the two concepts. Um, Going back in time, like, say, to the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, one of the big landmark events in all that was the Montgomery bus boycotts that were led by, citizen and then civil rights activist Rosa Parks. And probably most all of you know this, but basically back in the late 50s, 60s, there were still some segregated institutions in our country, and there was a social norm having to do with people who would board and transport around on public bus systems. So in Montgomery, Alabama, uh, Rosa Parks, a black citizen, was upset because basically the social norm at the time, the expectation was that if there were seats available at the front of the bus, um, but sorry, if there were no seats available at the front of the bus, but there were some available at the back, and say that a white customer boards the bus, the social expectation was that if there were black citizens sitting up in the front seats, that they should now remove to the back to clear space at the front for the white customers. And of course, this is a little bit disrespectful, not just a little bit, but it's significantly disrespectful because it creates sort of like a second-class citizen status for black citizens, like as if they don't have the same entitlement that anybody else has to just have any optimal seat on the bus, as though the nice seats where you don't have to walk so far are reserved for people of a certain race or color. But of course, in a society that's equal, we should all be treated the same. So Rosa Parks, she's one person who was a victim of this kind of unjust behavior, and she led the boycotts, which successfully changed the rules and sparked even wider reforms in society. Now, you could have been a white citizen at that time, as many were, and you could have been upset at the existence of the status quo. But you wouldn't have felt resentment per se because you're not yourself the victim directly affected by the unjust behavior. Now, that's a historical example, but it of course applies today too. There can be things happening in society where perhaps you are not the direct person or type of person burdened by that particular form of injustice. But sometimes you can still feel outrage on the behalf of others that are harmed by it and just, you know, outraged at the general existence of an unjust practice. But it becomes a little more personal and perhaps biting when it happens to you, and that's the difference between moral outrage and resentment. Now, another one of these moral sentiments, as we fill out, the last few of them, is guilt as opposed to shame. So guilt um, is a bad feeling um, that results from having committed a wrong. So when you feel guilt, it makes you want to um, do what you could to correct the wrong if possible, or at least make amends for it or apologize. Um, but there's a difference between guilt and shame. So shame is a bad feeling also, but it's from a different reason. It's a bad feeling that results from violating a social norm. Okay, there we go. So Given these definitions, I'm going to ask if anyone can think of a scenario where a person could feel shame without guilt. Guilt, you feel bad. Why? Because you did something that you regard as wrong. Shame, you feel bad, but it's sort of not because you necessarily think you did anything wrong, just because you violated a social norm or expectation. So, what kind of scenario would a person feel shame but not guilt? If what they did was blank but not blank, something along those lines. Okay, Kay, you say you farted in public. There you go. That's a funny example, but I can agree, I guess. Like, suppose that someone's in a classroom setting. As you all know, there is a social norm that you're not supposed to, to the best of your ability, make loud, like bodily noises of those kinds. And if you did, I bet you'd feel pretty embarrassed in the moment, feeling a sense of shame because you stepped out of line of what the norms and expectations would be. But can you really say that you feel guilt? Not necessarily, because it's not like you did something to deliberately cause harm, or it's, after all, it's a bodily function. So reasonably, a person might say, I couldn't control this, or even if I could, I didn't like do something evil or malicious. So that could be shame without guilt, sure. Catherine, you talk about a faux pas, sure. Maybe like you dressed in the wrong attire to a formal event, so you read the note wrong. You show up just wearing casual stuff, and everyone's like in all kinds of dresses and suits. You might see people looking at you, snickering a little bit, like, "Wow, she didn't, get the memo about the dress code." But it's not like you're going to necessarily feel guilt, because inattention to those details doesn't qualify as like an evil or immoral act, but it is outside the social norm of the setting that you're in. So people can sometimes confuse guilt with shame, and that's sometimes the reason that people say, like, I don't like feeling guilt, don't give me a guilt trip, um, as though it's bad for you to feel guilt. But guilt in itself is actually nothing wrong, because, as I've said before, a person who has no tendency to ever feel guilt, no matter what they do, is like a psychopathic person that's not mentally stable, or at least not healthy. So the person who is wanting to treat guilt as though it's this negative factor might be confusing it with shame. Like, don't make me feel ashamed of something if I haven't actually done something wrong. Now, that's a fair criticism to make. But we can sometimes get lost in the subtle distinctions between these two. And the book mentions, for example, that in previous generations, and even to some extent today, people who are, like, say, gay could feel a sense of shame but not guilt if the social norm or expectation within their community or within their family or something is to be heteronormative and straight. But if the person, of course, doesn't think that they had any choice in the matter, and they just find themselves having these kinds of particular desires, then they probably wouldn't feel any sense of guilt, since it's not like they've made a moral choice to do something quote unquote wrong. Rather, though, shame could be felt if they feel that they're outside the social expectations of some kind of social unit. All right. Couldn't shame be like embarrassment in the term of similar feelings? Yes, it certainly could be. Um, Sometimes, I guess, embarrassment is experienced when you're around people, but shame could be experienced also whether or not you're in a social setting where everyone can be aware of it. So, I mean, there might be a subtle distinction there, but there's a lot of overlap in the two concepts, it's fair to say. John, tripping in public, yeah. So you lose your footing. That's certainly an embarrassing thing. It might seem like a little shameful to be isolated from the group because of that, but it's not something that necessarily induces guilt. Okay, so there's more to say about this chapter, but I don't want to get through too much of the notes all at once, because we have 3 full meetings devoted to it. So I'll probably just allow us to break for now, and we will resume with some more of the notes on Thursday on the same chapter, chapter 9. So just make sure you read those designated pages, and whenever you're ready, you can start thinking about or getting your material ready for the 4th homework too. So then, are we all good, everybody? I don't want to close the streams too fast, but if you feel like good to go, just let me know in the chat, and then I'll end these 2 streams one by one. So let's see how it's going. Are we all good? Okay, thanks, Armand, for the thumbs up. Anybody else just looking for some reactions? Okay, great. Thank you, Dawson. We are going to talk about moral theories. Absolutely, Gabriel. We're going to talk about utilitarianism, and then we're going to talk about Kantianism. Gabriel, you got to build up slowly. First, we talk about general concepts of morality, but it gets much more technical and detailed once we get into utilitarian and Kantian moral theories. we're definitely going to talk about those. Those are universalist moral theories that try to give us answers as to what specifically makes an act objectively right or wrong. And so I know that you may find it to be a little bit too much common sense talk, like intuitively it's wrong to lie. Intuitively, there's nothing wrong with being gay. Stuff like that. Yeah, it may not have the rigor that you're looking for yet, but it's going to be filled in when we get to the moral theories. And I'm just following them in the order that the textbook provides, right? The textbook saves the moral theories for after these initial discussions. It's good to run before you crawl sometimes, but we got to go in the proper order for our whole class. Not to worry. So, all right, everybody, I'm going to let us go. Thanks again so much for everything, and I'll be in touch with you anytime. So take care and pay attention to the announcements where I will post this lecture and also the link to the Thursday meeting. All right, have a great one, and see you guys next time. Okay, so goodbye to Zoom, guys. See you guys soon. And then on the other hand here, see you guys soon, the YouTubers. Take it easy. Bye-bye.